All right, guys, welcome back to class. We are going to be talking about populations today and how do we study the ecology at the population level. So we've kind of gotten away from the overview of ecology and we're going into the actual different levels of organization now. So let's start this off with a case study. Remember, this was one of the ways that we could get our scientific knowledge without performing some type of experiment. It's sort of like a type of observation. So this case study is really fascinating, and it involves something that's been going on for over 150 years now. So prior to 1859, there were no rabbits in Australia. Rabbits are what we call placental mammals. They carry their young and give birth just like humans do. In Australia, though, they only have marsupials, the ones that carry their babies in pouches, which is a little bit different than what we have. So there were no rabbits, these placental rabbits in Australia. But in 1859, a farmer who owned a ranch in England said, you know what? I really miss having rabbits to hunt. So I'm going to take some European rabbits that I brought with me on the ship, and I'm going to release them on my ranch here in Australia. And that way I have something to hunt and something to remind me of England. Well, not even 10 years later, there was 2 million rabbits hunted on his farm, and his farm alone. That didn't include the surrounding areas. So 24 rabbits turned into more than 2 million rabbits in less than 10 years. And like I said, that was 2 million that were hunted. So that was just what they killed, not what was out there. And the rabbits spread like wildfire across Australia. They ate all the plants and destroyed a lot of the plant life. And when that plant life died, everything that depended on it started to die as well. So you saw a huge breakdown in the ecosystem of Australia. It pushed many native species to the brink of extinction. So who knew that such a small change, 24 cute little tiny rabbits that you wouldn't think could harm a fly, could have such a huge impact on an entire country, an entire continent. So we're going to look at why this happened as we go through this PowerPoint. So think about, why weren't these rabbits a problem in England? Why are they only a problem here in Australia? Why did they become such a big problem? And how would you stop it? All right, getting back to the topic at hand a little bit. Population ecology studies a specific group of the same species in a given area. So remember that a population is just a group of the same species in the same area. So in this image here, you see a bunch of sheep, most likely in New Zealand it looks like. So one sheep would be the individual level. The step up is the population, all of the sheep in that given area. So this type of ecology focuses on what is the range of these animals? How close together do they live? What's their distribution? What's their growth rate as a species? Do they reproduce very quickly or very slowly? And how many old versus young do we have in the population? So the first one, geographic range, this is the area inhabited by the population. So the size of a range can vary drastically in size. Think about a bacteria. It's not going to have miles and miles and miles of a range because it's not going to be able to really move on its own. It's going to have one little spot that it lives in for most of its life. But then think about a whale that migrates across the entire ocean. Those are two drastically different geographic ranges. And so we can't study them the same exact way. We have to understand what the range of each species is in order to understand how to study it. So the one problem with our geographic ranges is how they're being affected by people now. So overpopulation of humans, we are pushing into their territories, into their home range, and we are building and taking away the natural habitat. So we're having a big issue now with organisms trying to live in their natural range, and they can't find the space to do that. Another big problem that's affecting these ranges are invasive species. So this is another issue that humans are kind of the main cause, I guess you could say. We are taking these species and we are moving them to places that they're not native to. And they'll have new things that are going to compete with them, or maybe nothing competing with them. They're going to have new food availability, all of this stuff that could potentially result in a population explosion, or it could result in extinctions. So over time, species can go extinct as well. Maybe their habitat is just so destroyed that they can't survive anymore. Maybe something they relied on for food has gone extinct, and so that means they go extinct as well. Now, let's talk about density and distribution. So population density, this one is a little complicated to understand. It's the number of individuals per unit area. So I can say, I want to count the number of trees in 100 square meters or 100 square miles. That would be my population density. So if you look at this map, we draw the lines, we draw the unit area as countries. And we're looking at the population density of each country, with the really dark colors being a high population in that area. So it has a lot of people in a small area, versus the lighter colors, you have very few people in that area. So you see countries like India and the UK and Korea, they have a really high population density, a lot of people living in not a lot of space. Places like Canada and Russia and Australia, you have very few people living in a lot of space. So it differs by the species. If you're looking at a unit area of a field, so let's say the soccer field by our school, there may be some mice that live there and they come out at night, and there may be some owls that are living in the trees. There's going to be a different density for the mice than there is for the owls. It's all determined by the species that we are looking at. Now, the second part of this is distribution. So how do the individuals spread out across their range? Because some species really like to live alone, and some are more group animals, so that will affect how they move throughout their range. There's random, uniform, and clumped distributions. So if we look at the pictures on the left, you get a really good idea of what that means. So clumped, you're going to have little groupings or clumpings of the species in their range. Random is going to be just that. They're going to be randomly spaced throughout. That's one that you'll often see with things like plants, because they can't really control where their seeds get blown and moved. So it's going to be a random placement, and then they don't move themselves. So wherever they're stuck is where they're stuck. Now, uniform is where they evenly space themselves throughout. They're going to have a nice even space in between all the individuals. And this is normally something that an animal that can move and has some kind of higher intelligence is doing. So they want to give themselves space from all the others to cut down on competition. Now, the other thing that we look at with populations is their age structure as a whole. So how many females and how many males of each age group do we have in the population? It can tell us a lot about the population itself. So, for example, what if I told you that this population of organisms is mostly female, and they're mostly very young or very old females? What if I say that there's lots of adult males but very few adult females? All of that will change how the organism is going to interact with its environment and how the individuals interact with each other. And it will also tell you a lot about how that population is going to grow. That's the key thing with these age structures. we're predicting growth curves. We're predicting how these organisms will end up growing. So if I have a lot of babies, a lot of young people, well, those young people are going to grow up and have babies of their own. And usually people will end up having 1 or 2 or 3 babies, so their population is actually going to grow. Now, if I have a lot of older people and very few young people, my population is actually going to shrink most likely, because I'm going to have suddenly a large portion of the population die because they're older and very few young people coming up and having their own kids. So you'll look at this type of structure that looks like a really good pyramid is rapid growth. You're going to see a huge amount of growth in these countries. And they give you 3 examples: Guatemala, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. A lot of our developing world, places like sub-Saharan Africa or India or China, you're seeing this type of growth structure right now, where you're having a huge boom in the population. If you have zero growth, you look like you kind of have a nice rectangle there with maybe a little bit of a drop off as you get older, because that's normal. So this is in a lot of our European countries right now. In Japan, you're seeing not a lot of people are having kids, so the population isn't really growing, it's staying stable. Then you can have this negative growth, like I said before, where you have more older people than you do younger. It's like an upside down funnel there, or it is like a funnel. And actually, I misspoke. Japan is not a zero growth. Japan is actually in negative growth right now. They have a lot of people who are saying, I just don't want kids at all. So their population is declining very rapidly. There's very few young people and a lot of older people. So like I said, all of those age structures determine our growth rate. So our growth rate, it'll tell you whether the population is increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. And it's determined by a few factors. First, obviously, birth rate and death rate. I'm going to have people being born, and that's adding to my numbers. If people die, that's taking away from my numbers. Then you have immigration and emigration. We'll talk about more what those mean in a second. You have limiting factors. What are the things that limit the growth of my population? And how do I interact with other organisms as a population? So let's look at this curve here. What happens to your population size if you have more individuals born than dying? So if I have more people being born, like 3 people being born a day and only 1 person dying a day, what's going to happen? Write that down in your notes before I give you the answer. Now, what happens to your population if more individuals are dying than being born? So you have 3 people dying and only 1 person being born a day. And what happens to your population if you have an equal number of deaths and births? So in the first case, our population is going to grow. I'm adding more people than are leaving, so I'm growing. If I have more people leaving than coming in, my population is decreasing. And if there's an equal number of births and deaths, there's no change in my population. Now, a lot of people think, well, if my population isn't growing, then it's exactly the same. Nothing is changing at all. But it's actually more an equal number of births and deaths, because you can't exactly stop people from being born or stop people from dying. It's just more that they're at an equilibrium with each other. Now, the other two were immigration and emigration. So immigration kind of sounds like I'm moving into an area. This is the process of individuals moving in from somewhere else. So I'm going to immigrate to a new country. People coming to America are immigrants. Now, emigration is the process of leaving their home range to go somewhere else. A lot of species do this, like bees, for instance. The queen will emigrate. So the queen will lay a bunch of eggs, and the few that are going to become queens, they have to leave and go found their own beehive. So in this case, emigration is an exit. So think I for in and E for exit. I'm going to be exiting my group and joining another. So they usually go hand in hand. If I am emigrating from one group, I'm going to be immigrating into the other group. Now, what are some things that will limit the growth of my population? What are some things that keep me from growing out of control? You have things like competition, predators. If I have a lot of natural predators in an area, I'm not going to grow as fast as if I have no predators. Parasitism and disease. If I'm constantly having something eat away at my strength, I'm not going to be able to reproduce as well. Or maybe I reproduce, but they're very sick and they die. Any unusual weather. If I have a sudden flood, like a hurricane, or if there's a fire or a tornado, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of deaths. So unusual weather and natural disasters kind of go hand in hand. So all of these are limiting factors. I can only grow as much as my resources allow me. And if my resources don't allow me to grow very much, I'm going to be limited by them. So these limiting factors determine something called carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a species that the area can support. So for example, there's going to be a carrying capacity for humans in California. There's only a certain number of resources that will allow humans to grow here, whether that's space, which is probably the biggest limiting factor right now. We don't have a lot of space to put all these people, whether it's the amount of water that we can get, whether it's the amount of food that we can grow, something is always going to limit how big our population can get. And that maximum number based on my resources is the carrying capacity. So you kind of can think of it as a bucket. There's a top to that bucket. I can't fill it any more than that. Otherwise, I'll have overflow. So the overflow is things like diseases. Those are going to limit my population growth, or maybe my predators will come in and eat me. So that's going to affect my carrying capacity. But the carrying capacity is the absolute maximum number that you can have in an environment before you run out of resources. So usually what happens is a population will hit this point and then it'll have an equal number of births and deaths. And so the population will stay pretty stable. So when we're talking about growth here, there's density dependent limiting factors and density independent limiting factors. Density dependent, this depends on how close together, how dense the population is, how many are in a specific area. So things like competition are density dependent factors. If I am a tree and I am in the middle of nowhere, I can pretty much go wherever I want and I have unlimited resources. But if I'm a tree in the middle of the forest, I'm going to be competing with other trees. So the amount of trees in an area is going to affect my ability to grow into a bigger population. So things like predation, herbivores, parasitism, disease, all of these are density dependent. They depend on how many organisms you have in that area. So if we compare it back to our M&M lab, if we added 3 more people to have to take M&Ms out of the cup, would there be more competition or less competition? Would that result in more dying or fewer dying? The more people that you add, the fewer resources to go around. Now, another one of these density-dependent factors is this predator-prey relationship. So this one is one that we're actually going to learn how to graph. So we look at how each affects the other, and both are going to go up and down depending on the other. So if we look at this graph here, the blue is the wolves and the red is the moose. So we can track our wolf population here and we can compare it to the moose. So we see that as the moose population increases, my wolf population can increase as well because they're getting more food to eat. But if my wolf population goes higher than my moose population right here, the wolves are suddenly going to crash because they don't have enough food to go around. So in this case, that's what happened, but it was also linked to the outbreak of a disease. So remember, we have other factors that are going to affect our relationships as well. Same thing happened here to our moose. They were doing so well. Their population was going so high because the wolf population was so low. They didn't have a lot of predators, so they were able to grow and expand. But then a disease hit them again, and their population was devastated. So it allowed the wolves a chance to kind of grow back up. So this is what your typical predator-prey graph will look like. I have, as my prey goes up, my predators grow up because they'll have more food available to them. But at some point, there's going to be too many predators, and my prey is going to collapse. When there's not enough prey to go around, my predators collapse too. They end up dying because they don't have enough food. So it makes this really nice graph with peaks and valleys. Now, in your notes, I want you to answer this question. How do herbivores affect populations? So we just looked at predator and prey, but where do the herbivores come in? How would they really affect what's going on in my ecosystem? Would a predator-prey graph apply to an herbivore? Do predators or the herbivores affect more populations, and why? So pause the video, try to answer that, and then start up again. All right, so we're going to watch a quick video here about this predator-prey relationship, and you'll see that it's a lot more than just how does the predator affect the prey.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So, pretty fascinating stuff there when you really think about it. It just goes to show how interconnected all of life really is, and how even the smallest little piece can have an impact that you can't even understand. It just goes to show how beautifully everything is balanced in this world. Okay. So now let's move on to the density independent factors. So all of that had to do with how many were in the population. But there's a lot of things in this world that affect us that it doesn't matter how many are in the area. For example, things like unusual weather patterns like fires or droughts or floods. So these will happen whether you have a large population or a small population. They don't care about your density. And what will happen is you'll see a large crash in the population immediately after. You'll see a lot of people or a lot of organisms die from this. And then it will either continue to collapse or it will grow back depending on what happened. Now, emigration is key here. When I exit the area and go to a new home area, that is the only way that my species will really be able to survive. So you can always leave the affected area. Now, something to think about, so pause it and write the answer down. Are human influences density dependent or density independent on the environment and on organisms living in the environment? And are we predators? Why or why not? Now, one thing that I mentioned earlier is invasive species. So this is something that humans are unfortunately a big part of the cause here. We've taken these organisms out of their natural habitat and purposefully or accidentally carried them somewhere new. Now, in this new habitat, many die right away because they don't have the right nutrients or because there's too much competition or new predators, but just enough can survive better than they did where they came from. Maybe they have no new predators. Maybe that there's so many new resources for them that they see a population growth like they've never seen before. Back in their original home, they were quite in balance with their surroundings. But in their new home, no one's ever seen anything like this before. So the population and the ecosystem try to balance each other out and they end up losing. So these species can devastate local ecosystems. One example here that you see in the picture, those are trees and bushes covered by a vine called kudzu, and it's all over the South in America. So you'll be just driving down the road and you'll just see these vines for miles and miles and miles, and they're choking the natural plant life. They're killing the trees and they're killing the plants underneath because they can't get any sunlight. The other example is the Australian rabbits that we talked about before, but I'll get into that more later. So now think back to that problem of the rabbits. After what we just talked about with the predator-prey curves and the density-dependent and independent factors and how invasive species work, what factors do you think could limit the size of the rabbit population? What is missing that allowed their population to explode so greatly? So pause, write the answer down, and then move on. So the exponential is this one right here. And you have a logistic growth graph. So they have nicknames. This one's called a J curve and this one's called an S curve because they kind of look like that letter there. So let's go into what these are. Exponential growth, or a J curve. This is a population growth where you have plentiful resources. You don't really have a lot of limiting factors. You have enough food, you have enough shelter, you have enough sunlight, you have enough water, and you can grow as much as you want to. There's nothing that seems is going to slow your population down. So these are what we call ideal conditions. And we're going to have unlimited growth. We often see this in bacteria. They'll go through this period where they have unlimited resources when they come to a new area, and they will just explode in population because they also divide very quickly. Another example is the human population. Right now, our resources are essentially unlimited because we keep using technology to find new ways of staying alive and feeding and caring for more people. So right now, if you look at our human population curve, it will look like a J. So as I said, here is an example graph of the human population growth curve right now. So it's going from 2000 to 2100, so this is also a projected graph. So we are about right here right now. So we still can see the massive J-shaped curve that has been occurring in our populations. But now if you look at the colors, this is where it's really interesting. If you look at the more developed regions, places like Europe and America, you have mostly what looks like an S curve. It's kind of leveling out. Where you see the J curve is in these less developed regions, places like sub-Saharan Africa and India and other parts of Asia. They're finally getting all that technology that the Western world developed 100 years ago, and that's allowing them to have enough food, enough shelter, enough medicine, so their population is growing like crazy. Now, right around 1940 to 1960, right in here, is where we really start seeing the greatest uptick in the population. I want you to think about what could have been causing that. What really happened in this time period that would have led to that? Now, the next curve is the logistic growth, or the S curve. So we have rapid growth in phase 1. And it kind of looks like it's going to become a J curve at this point. But in phase 2, we start to slow our growth down and it starts to level out again. And then phase 3 is where our growth stops. We become a stable population and we have an equal number of births and deaths. And where is it going to stabilize? It's going to stabilize at that carrying capacity, the maximum number that our environment can support. So now when I say we have equal births and deaths, it's not a flat line. You're going to have this little kind of wiggle in your population curve on your graph, because some years maybe you'll have a few more births, some years maybe you'll have a few more deaths, but overall it's an equal number of both. Now back to our case study here. Now we've put all the pieces together. So what do you think was happening to these Australian rabbits? Well, as I said before, there was no native rabbits to Australia prior to their introduction. So there were no density dependent factors to control their population. They didn't have to fight with any other rabbit type organism for food or for space. So they were able to get as many nutrients as they could. They had unlimited space to grow into. So their populations just exploded. Another density-dependent factor that they lacked was predators. There was no natural predator in Australia to eat them. So without that predator, mainly the wolf back in England, these bunnies were able to grow out of control. They also had fewer diseases, fewer parasites. So everything was in the perfect aligned setup for these rabbits to just have a crazy population explosion. Now, since then, we've tried many different ways to control the population, hunting obviously being one of them. But rabbits, they reproduce so quickly, there's just no way to hunt them all. So they decided that they were going to introduce a virus into the rabbit population. And it worked. For a really long time, it worked great. The population collapsed but like crazy. It was like a straight drop down. But there's always some amount of a population that's going to be immune to that virus. And they were able to survive and they were able to reproduce. And in that, they were able to, as a species, evolve a resistance because their ancestors were resistant to this bacteria or this virus, so all the babies would be as well. Now, we're trying a second virus right now, but it seems like it's failing as well. There's always going to be some type of resistance that evolves to these viruses in a population over time. So what do you think would be a good solution? We've tried viruses, we've tried hunting. What else could you do? So just think about that. We'll talk about this more in class. I'm sorry it was such a long video today, but there was a lot to cover. This is probably our most complicated, in-depth topic of this unit. Come to class with your questions. If you don't understand anything, remember we do have a quiz next class on characteristics of life and the intro to ecology. So review that, but we will also go over this and we'll do a special a lab where we pretend to be predators and prey and we make our own growth curve and our own graph to analyze. Hope you guys enjoyed it and I will see you soon.